There are a great many techniques of predicting the future. I just don't master any of them. I'm an organizational scientist, and as scientists, we tend to look to the past in order to predict what might happen in the future. And admittedly, many times we get it wrong, but sometimes we stand a fighting chance. And that is particularly the case when all, quote unquote, we have to do is we have to elaborate on trends that are already manifesting themselves while we speak, instead of speculating about what might happen. Nobody put this more beautifully than management mastermind Peter Drucker in an article entitled "The Futures That Have Already Happened," published in The Economist in 1989. Having elaborated on 5 global trends in the economy at the time then, he summarizes, and I'm quoting now, "The trends that I've described above are, if you will, conclusions. Everything discussed here has already happened. It is only the full impacts that are still to come." So, in trying to draw a picture of the future of work for you, I would like to adhere to Drucker in spirit by elaborating on trends and extrapolating trends that are already gaining momentum while we speak, but once they fully kick in, will change the face of work as we've seen it in the past. So the first legitimate question is, what are these trends? There are many trends in the labor market, but 4, I think, are paramount in the context of today's talk. And trend number 1, how could it be any different these days, has to do with artificial intelligence. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic taking over the media, there wouldn't be one single day where you wouldn't be reading about another machine learning-based startup in the news. And yes, it's true, narrow AI is becoming more powerful. But it's also part of the truth that there will always be domains, not always, but at least in the foreseeable future, when humans will still govern the activity. And those are domains which require dexterity, perception, creativity. Trend number 2. We've been living in the information age for a long while. We continue to do so. We produce research and development every day. Knowledge is becoming more abundant. It's becoming more complex. It's a no-brainer. Trend number 3. The world population continues to grow, and with the world population growing, so do markets. And finally, and very importantly in the context of today's talk, trend number 4. Economic inequality is rising dramatically in almost every part of the world. And there are already loads of economies out there in which salaries these days can only pay for consumption, but they don't allow you to create wealth anymore so that you could live off the rents, as epitomized by this beautiful metaphor of jumping on the property ladder. So if I assume now that these 4 trends start to fully kick in and interact with one another, how does that potentially change the face of work? I think when trend number 1 starts to kick in really heavily, we will be seeing that there will be a great divide in the workforce. Unfortunately, there will be some who will lose out in the race against the machine, and those we will have to think about as society, how we want to integrate them. Those people who can no longer productively contribute to society in a traditional sense. But that's not the topic of my talk today. The topic of my talk today is about those who will still be part of the workforce, and here I assume that they will invest in abilities and skills that will still make them valuable in the near future. So they will invest in their dexterous skills, they will invest in their perceptive skills, and they will try to be creative. Now, I think we shouldn't exaggerate here, right? When I say that people will try to be creative, it would be presumptuous to believe that we can all go back and be the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe types or the Leonardo da Vinci types, spanning distant domains of knowledge, such as, arts and medicine and physics and literature. The fewest of us can. Most of us will be specialists. But we will be different specialists than the specialists of the last 30 or 40 years. We will no longer, be rewarded for carrying out routine tasks, complicated routine tasks. Instead, I believe we will become something that I would call creative niche generalists, spanning and recombining knowledge from adjacent domains of knowledge, as we already see, for example, in modern drug design, between microbiology, chemistry, and information technology. Now, one thing is very clear. This type of staff is going to push traditional organizations to their limits. And why is that so? Traditional organizations are great at managing routine output through managerial control. But when the output is no longer routine, managers would have to be in the know of a lot of detail which they don't have. They would have to constantly engage in exception management, something which doesn't work. So the answer to the question of can traditional organizations of this type here still coordinate the type of staff that will likely emerge from these trends is probably badly. But what is the consequence of this then? Will we all go back, as traditional writings would suggest, to a market-based society in which everybody sits at home with their computers and 3D printers, everybody being an entrepreneur, all of us being magically coordinated by some price mechanism of procurement prices and sales prices and so forth? It takes a trained neoclassical economist, preferably with a PhD, to believe in something that unrealistic. Jokes aside, every scientist with a sense of realism, including selected economists, will immediately say this won't be the case, because there are at least two reasons as to why individuals will still flock into organizations. The first one comes in the form of trend number 3, which I highlighted before. With increasing demand, people will need to pool their resources in order to cater to the market size. But much more importantly, as we've shown in decades of research, individuals want to be part of a group. They want to be part of a private group, but they also want to be part of a work group. And so it's the sense of belonging which will ultimately, make them flock again in organizations in the future. So the future of work is going to be a future of organizations. The question is just which type of organization, okay? And here I think it's important to bear in mind what I said about trend number 4. So trend number 4 ultimately will mean that your generation, earlier than any other generation before you, will reach the point where an additional 5%, 10%, 15% of increase in salary is not going to mean much to you anymore. And why is that? Because once your consumption needs are fulfilled, what do you do with the money? Or let me put this slightly differently, whereas your fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, big sisters, big brothers, could still legitimately hope that in exchange for working the better parts of their bodies off for 10, 15 years, they would be buying their country house or their city apartment. That's not going to happen for you. Let me break the bad news for you. Salaries won't buy city apartments in Vienna in the near future. So it's obvious that it's a very rational response that people will look for other types of rewards than money. And yes, of course, we already see that now. They ask for work-life balance, they ask for other types of rewards. But I think an important point has been neglected, and the point is that you want to work in an organization which actually, sort of makes sure that your ideas and your power, make it to the top. And that obviously won't be happening in these rigid, multi-layered hierarchies of the past. So instead, I think, what is going to happen is you will be looking for places that give you something which is important, has always been important to any generation of worker, but is going to be earlier important to you than to any other generation of workers before. You'll be looking for work satisfaction. Work satisfaction is going to become paramount. And it's precisely for that reason that I predict that the well-trained of you will eventually flock together in organizations which I would call novel forms of organizing. And these novel forms of organizing are organizations that essentially have the following feature. This traditional managerial output control is increasingly giving way to a decentralized way of decision-making. Or, let me visualize that for you, you will be far less likely winding up in a scenario of the left-hand side there, where managerial authorities, people who can legitimately demand obedient behavior from you within a certain domain, and stacked systems there of hierarchies will govern the work that you conduct. And much more likely will you be winding up in a scenario of the right-hand side from your perspective, where teams of people, peers, equals, potentially together with temporary team leaders, legitimized by competence and so forth, will be conducting the work. Now let me put in an important disclaimer here. Let's not be so naive to believe that these organizations there on the right side are without problems. They have their own problems, okay? But the reason why I still predict that they will be taking over and will be paramount is because despite all the problems they have, they at least offer a chance for you to attain the work satisfaction that you would want to have, okay? And why is that so? Well, because they address the 5 fundamental problems of organizing in a way that permits creating motivation for employees of the type which we just discussed before. What are these 5 fundamental problems of organizing? They're always the same, no matter which type of organization you look at, because organizations need to make sure that jointly the individuals will attain more than the sum of the individuals. So they have to divide labor and integrate effort, and in order to do so, they have to ask themselves the following question: how do we split the work? Who does what? Who gets how much? Who needs to know what? And how do we resolve an argument if there is one? And what I would like to discuss, or maybe rather showcase for you over the next couple of minutes, is just that these flat organizations, despite all the issues that they have, at least offer the potential through the decentralization along these questions of giving you the motivation, making the firm more effective, and potentially even more efficient than a traditional organization. So let's start with the first question, how we split the work. If you think of a traditional organization, a manager may dream up a project, okay? So let's say she comes up with a project of creating watches, and then she decomposes that big goal into subtasks, and she comes up with her task list of producing the face, the case, and the arms of a watch. In a non-traditional organization, that may look very different. First of all, peers may have different ideas. And secondly, they may come up with different task lists. Now, your question is, why might this be good? And my answer to you is, because of the nature of the creative niche generalist we described above. If the person actually knows better what the demand would be, what the technology can do, let them decide. So that not only makes the firm more effective, but as a matter of fact also, and that's the reinforcing cycle, may instill a sense of autonomy and motivation among the peer and make the firm a better place. Same logic holds for task allocation. In a traditional organization, a manager would, based on her best knowledge, what people are good at and what they want to do, allocate the different tasks. In a non-traditional form, usually, this kind of choice is left to self-selection. Because people know better what they're good at and people know better what they like. And again, the same logic of a reinforcing cycle of effectiveness and motivation starts to occur. But let's not only focus on the employees, let's also think about the managers for a second here, okay? So managers, at least to the extent that they redefine their roles of no longer wanting to see the troops march and feeling great, but managers who actually perceive of themselves as facilitators, arbitrators, coordinators, and so forth, may actually gain a lot from these flat organizations in the sense that it reduces workload for them, okay? How can this reduce workload for them? Let's start with the simplest example, salary setting. One of the notorious problems when you want to assign bonuses to team members is that as a manager, you need to know who did what. If you don't have that detail, you may end up with an outcome which is being perceived as unfair. That's why novel forms of organizing have very successfully experimented around with democratic voting rules where peers actually vote on each other's salary. It's this lack of knowledge on the part of the manager which also makes otherwise super efficient information hierarchies where information is being disseminated top-down inefficient. Yes, if a manager knows precisely what a subordinate needs to know, hierarchy is the most efficient way of disseminating the information, but what if the top agent doesn't know what a certain member within the organization may need to know at a given point in time? Then you end up with an ineffective outcome and there's no more efficiency consideration. That's why novel forms of organizing usually rely on peer-to-peer information, a very laborious exchange, time-taking for the employees, but leading to more information aggregation and, nicely, taking away some work for the manager. But nowhere is this efficiency in taking and liberating time for the manager for other things more visible than in a context of conflict resolution. Anybody who's ever dealt with, employee disputes knows that it is one of the most laborious tasks to engage in mitigating between, deciding on disputes between two employees. Be this an incentive conflict where people may actually really have different preferences, or a coordination conflict where they may want to do the same thing, but they have different views on how to get there. Novel forms of organizing, therefore, rely on peer-to-peer resolution mechanisms. And these peer-to-peer resolution mechanisms are those where usually peers initially discuss with one another, then use an extended board, and only as sort of an ultima ratio case will rely on the intervention of an authority which is usually legitimized by a lot of competence and just decides on one case. So hopefully, these last examples, these fictitious examples, have made one point clear. At least there is the potential for flat organizations to create motivation, be effective and efficient. But hopefully they've also highlighted a different point, which I think is very important. You have the choice to decentralize or centralize along at least 5 dimensions. And that's why there's not going to be one flat organization. As a matter of fact, there's going to be a plethora of different flat organizations, some of which will work better in the context of one organization, some will work better in the context of another, some won't work at all. But my credo, and coming to the end of this presentation, is the future of work will be colorful, okay? It will be colorful. There will be many different types of flat organizations, I dare to predict, which all have one thing in common, that they thrive on well-trained staff. Well-trained staff who appreciates autonomy and the ability to participate, and in exchange is willing to put up with the burden of being accountable. Because there's no such thing as a free lunch, as you know, so being accountable for your actions is part of the equation. And that's also why in this color scheme there's going to be light gray, pale gray, dark gray, black, so the traditional organizations are not going to disappear. Why? Because of course, there will always be people who prefer to follow orders and delegate responsibility than be responsible themselves. Admittedly, there's also another reason why traditional organizations will survive, and that's because they are superior at one thing, and that's what we call superscaling. So when we're talking about really large organizations, you will almost always see that some hierarchical element will prevail, and that's because the information costs just explode when you move to a lot of people. So let me just visualize that here. If you only think about an information exchange among 9 peers, okay, it takes 36 information exchanges for everyone to talk to one another, and you can achieve the same thing in a 2-layered hierarchy with just 8 information exchanges. Now, talking about this size of organization, that's not a problem. Talking about 10,000 employees, you may run into limits. So that's why there will be hierarchical elements out there, but within them there will be pockets of flat organizations, and there will, aside from those, be flat organizations autonomous of significantly large size. So what I'm trying to say is, novel forms of organizing will increasingly matter, and that is because decentralization can be very powerful. And let me stress the can be part here. As I said before, it's not that they are without problems. As a matter of fact, they have all sorts of problems. Jostling for power, creating in-group biases, what have you. But these are problems that can be overcome. And once they are overcome, they offer opportunities that other organizations can't. I'm sure that the future workers, that is you, will be able to overcome them. So in that spirit, more power to you, and thank you for your attention.